today. This event is titled Blue Crimes, Rethinking the Maritime Security Agenda. My name is Christian Bueger. I'm a professor at the University of Copenhagen and also one of the directors of the SafeSeas network, and I'll be your host today. At this event, we want to reflect on the concept of blue crime, the relations between different crimes at sea, what needs more attention, and how the various international responses can be better integrated, become more efficient. This event has been organized by the SafeSeas network on maritime security, and SafeSeas is an international collaborative effort to raise awareness for the importance of security at sea and to facilitate innovative but also high-class research on maritime security in different regions. And I'd like to invite you also to visit our website, which is at www.safeseas.net. Now, in the background of today's event is a paper that was published this September with the journal Marine Policy. And next, Professor Tim Edmunds from the University of Bristol, who's also one of the co-directors of the SafeSeas network, will introduce you to the core ideas behind the concept of blue crime and also how it transforms our thinking about maritime security. This will then be followed by comments from 4 distinguished experts that are delighted that they made the time to be here with us today. The event will be recorded and is on the record, to say. If you want to tweet about the event, then please use the hashtag #BlueCrime. I will now in a second hand over to Professor Tim Edmunds, and he is a professor at the University of Bristol, a leading specialist in security sector reform and one of the key voices in the current maritime security debate. And in his recent work, he has mainly looked at maritime security capacity building in Africa, but also crimes at sea, as well as the consequences of the Brexit process for maritime security in the UK, Europe, but also globally. I will hand over to Tim in a second, then we will go to our 4 experts. And if you have questions and comments later on, please do use the chat box or the Q&A function. And we hope that we can integrate as many voices as possible, as much time allows for us here today. And here I hand over to Tim to give us a short overview of blue crimes and what it means for the maritime security agenda. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Christian. Well, my job today is to introduce our blue crimes paper. I have about 10 minutes to do it in, so I shall necessarily try and be as focused as I can. But obviously we're going to raise a whole series of issues that we might want to talk about in related discussion, and the paper will form the basis of our discussant comments in our later Q&A as well. So where does our blue crime paper come from? Well, it emerges from a research project that's run by the SafeSeas network on transnational organised crime at sea, what we call the TOCAS project. The project's led by me, and we aim to study in the project expressions of maritime crime in the Indo-Pacific region and maritime security and law enforcement responses to them. Now, TOCAS itself came from a recognition of how the maritime security agenda seemed to be expanding to include an ever more diverse range of different maritime crimes and security challenges, not just piracy, but a whole range of other things as well, illegal fishing, smuggling, and so on and so on. And I think the importance of this change is indicated both by the broadening portfolios of maritime security organisations, and we might think here of the Djibouti Code of Conduct in the Western Indian Ocean, whose remit has now expanded a long way beyond its original mission of counter-piracy. but also by the fact that the issue or the problem of transnational organised crime at sea actually has made it to the UN Security Council, which held a debate on the topic in February 2019. Now, one of the interesting features of that debate was that it didn't finish with a clear conclusion or an official statement. And one of the reasons for that was because transnational organised crime at sea is a broad and quite a slippery concept. What does it mean? What's included within it? What's excluded from it? And how do we think about it in a meaningful and useful way? So the challenge here is to think about maritime crime in a way that recognises its diversity, the diversity of kind of activities it comprises, but also understands connections and provides a basis for an integrated response. So we needed, certainly for the TOCAS project, but perhaps more broadly, a framework for how to think about what we call blue crime. What were we trying to do in the paper? Well, our objectives first and foremost were pragmatic. We wanted a paper that would help us to assist and organise our own research endeavour. But more widely, we wanted to try and bridge discussions about individual types of crimes to highlight the contexts in which those crimes take place. So to move beyond the immediate expression of crime to highlight causes and facilitating factors too. And to identify synergies and intersections between different types of blue crime. We wanted our framework to be able to address the socially and geographically contingent nature of crime. So the fact that some things that might be a crime in one place or in one time may not be somewhere else or at another time. Now that meant that while we drew quite heavily on law-based approaches in the paper, they could only take us so far in addressing this particular question. We also wanted to think more broadly about, or at least to try and think broadly about the kind of harms that crime causes, maritime crime can cause, including in cases such as, for example, in many environmental crimes, where there may be no human victims at all. And we drew here on work in criminology and particularly the literature on green criminology to inform our work here. And what we came up with was a broad definition of what we call blue crime. That is, serious organised crimes or offences that take place transnationally on, in or across the maritime domain and cause or have the potential to inflict significant harms. On that basis, we then develop a more detailed classification in the paper based around the relationship that different forms of blue crime have to the sea and the ways in which they produce harms. So our classification, which hopefully you might be able to see on the screen now, comprises three dimensions of blue crime. The first of our dimensions comprises crimes against mobility. The target of crimes in this area are shipping or ships or what moves on the sea, and indeed the infrastructure that supports those movements. So we include ports in this as well. The site of harm is on ships or in ports, as well as more widely on global maritime trade and supply chain. And the paradigmatic example in this category is, of course, piracy. Our second dimension is of criminal flows. Here, this differs from the last category because here the sea is largely used as a transit point. It is a conduit for the movement of illicit goods or other criminal activities that take place between 2 points, generally on land. And here we're generally interested in issues of smuggling, narcotics, arms, wildlife, cultural artifacts and so on, as well as people smuggling and human trafficking. The site of harm for crimes in this category are the societies and communities into which illicit goods flow and have various pathological effects, as well as, at least in the case of human trafficking, the individuals themselves who are trafficked. And finally, our third category of crimes comprises environmental crimes. And here we are interested in what we might call crimes of the Anthropocene. They relate to harms that result from the interaction of humans with the natural environment, and where often it is the environment itself that is the victim of the crime. There may be second order effects of such crimes in relation to communities and individuals and so on, but often it's the marine environment itself that is damaged. The paradigmatic example here is IUU fishing and related fisheries crimes, but we might also include issues like pollution, oil spills, and so on. Now, notably, we do not include terrorism or extremist violence in our categorization. We had some considerable debate about this. We do recognize in the paper that there can be important crossovers between organized crime and extremist groups, so there can be important relations between the two. But we also argue that the perpetrators of the two different of these activities operate to quite different logics, rationalities, and goals, and indeed that legitimate responses to them can be quite different and indeed take place within different legal regimes. So we recognize the relationships, but we exclude extremist violence from our categorization. And broadly, this gives us a framework for how to think about TOCAS. Now, in the remainder of the paper, we then use this framework to explore some of the intersections and synergies between blue crimes. And I won't, and then come to some tentative conclusions. I won't say too much about this part of the paper because of our time constraints, but essentially we identify intersections around the skills and capacities necessary for many maritime crimes, which we argue are often quite easily or at least straightforwardly transferable between different types of crimes. We identify spatial intersections, that is, geographic areas around which forms of blue crime seem to cluster, whether those be trading routes or regions of instability. And finally, around shared business practices or forms of criminal enterprise, whether that be criminal finance, money laundering, and so on, as well as common practices such as fraud or forgery, forced labour, corrupt payments, and so on. We then go on to discuss the various reasons why different criminal groups might adapt between and within different forms of blue crime. So what conclusions did this lead us to? Well, tentatively, I think we can say, at least I hope the paper suggests or conveys the importance of being able to recognise diversity in maritime crime while also thinking in more integrated terms about responses. Now that entails, on the one hand, balancing between specific, focused and specialised responses to particular forms of criminal activity, which are often necessary on their own terms, but also suggesting the need for joined up approaches where intersections are present. That in turn implies that there is a need for strengthened information sharing between law enforcement actors working on different kinds of blue crime, which raises issues about the comparability of the data they use, and also the basic question, the basic issue that some maritime crimes are much better documented than the others. Finally, I think it points to the importance of leveraging different kinds of responses to fight blue crime. Sometimes law enforcement or security responses at sea will be appropriate, but it also implies that a wider set of responses on land as well as sea may be useful too. Now, these may include things like the investigation of criminal networks on land, more generalized harm reduction strategies, i.e. if you can't eliminate the crime, there may be ways to reduce the harm it causes. And finally, development responses to address root causes such as unemployment or economic exclusion in coastal communities. And that's the end of my 10 minutes, I think, Christian. So I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for giving us this overview of the concept of blue crime, but then also highlighting in particular the importance of looking at the interlinkages and finding the synergies between the different responses to these crimes. Allow me now to introduce our four distinguished experts, panelists here today, and we are super glad that you all made it reserved your afternoon or morning here today to discuss the concept, but also what follows from it here with us today. So each of the panelists will now have 5 to 7 minutes to share their ideas on blue crime and what should be done differently. And our first panelist here today is Jason Eligh. He's a senior expert with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. He is an illicit drug market and policy analyst who has researched and developed and led technical cooperation and assistance initiatives addressing illicit drugs in Africa, but also Asia. Our second panelist will be Maria Damanaki. She served as the European Union Commissioner for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries between 2010 and 2014. She actually introduced and implemented the Blue Growth Agenda for Seas and Oceans in Europe. Blue economy is now very much with us. She spearheaded it. And she also focused on bringing fish populations back to healthier levels. Following that, Maria Damanaki then served as the Global Managing Director for Oceans at the Nature Conservancy. So welcome. Thirdly, Cathy Haenlein will be speaking, and she's the Director of the Organized Crime and Policing Research Group and Senior Research Fellow at Rusi, with significant expertise in serious and organized crime, illicit trade, conflict, and also development. And Cathy has particularly focused also on transnational environmental crime with regional expertise in East and Southern Africa. Our last panelist will be Alan Cohen, and he's the head of the UNODC Global Maritime Crime Program, perhaps the most important capacity building program in the field of blue crime and maritime security, starting out in Eastern Africa, but now working all over the world. Prior to leading the UNODC program, he served for 18 years in the Royal Navy of the UK, and he also qualified as a barrister and practiced as a prosecutor and defense advocate. And everyone will be now speaking in that order, 5 to 7 minutes. And thank you again for making the time here today. And I very much look forward to learn about your ideas on blue crime and what should be done differently. And I now hand over to Jason. Jason, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. I want to thank the SafeSeas for this opportunity to be a part of this panel, and also appreciate the opportunity to be speaking with my colleagues on the panel as well. I think Tim's presentation on the issue of blue crime as a synopsis of the paper that was written is very good, and I think if a link to the paper can be shared with participants, that would help as well. I think it's important coming out of this paper that the profile around the diverse nature of maritime crime and the need for an effective, appropriate, and integrated response is raised. Now, as Christian said, I'm with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and we're an organization that's dedicated to developing an evidence base around organized crime, with the aim of promoting informed debate around and effective responses to transnational organized crime. In support of this goal, we maintain a global network of over 500 independent experts across a diversity of geographies and thematic areas. And I'd like to recognize Christian, if I can, who is a member of this network. And we're very thankful for his participation in this regard. Now, in presenting some initial remarks as the first speaker, I think it's a challenging job always to go first. So what I'd like to do, based on a reading of the paper and a listening to your presentation, is maybe from my perspective and my experience, return to first principles when we talk about transnational organized crime. And this is the need for governance and the objective of disruption. Now, first things first, I can't agree more with the conclusions in the paper that the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime is, let's describe it as far from being an effective instrument to influence global governance structures around a unified and relevant response. It has a limited definition of TOC, certainly in relation to the maritime environment. I think the implementation of the UNTOC has been patchy at best around the world. And also it's become an overly politicized instrument among member states. And this has led to it having a very weak review mechanism, certainly much weaker than that is contained in the UNCAC, which is the UN Convention Against Corruption, for example. I think a final concern would be that the fact that some of the UNTAC state parties perhaps have themselves questionable relationships with TLC markets and groups, and certainly this is another point of concern. As noted in the paper, other global and regional instruments have been ineffective as well in trying to organize a synergistic governance response around transnational organized crime in the sea. The world's seas are central to the existence and operation of global trade and the markets that this trade feeds. But of course, this includes both licit and illicit markets. Now, it's only natural that the resilience and security of maritime environments has become a recent concern for the UN Security Council, as Tim indicated, and was raised for initial discussion in February last year. Coming out of that, of course, is the challenge of framing, developing, and implementing effective responses to criminal activities and flows that occur on, in, and through these maritime environments. And this is a core struggle, and I think this is certainly the stepping off point for the paper coming out of this particular discussion, is to try and frame a response going forward. Now, at its base, this struggle to create effective governance structures involves a number of issues, and Tim has raised several of these. What is and is not a crime, the difference in legislative environments across the oceans, the states in the oceans and coastal states, who is responsible for interdicting, incapacities around interdiction, for example, the absence of coast guards, navies, etc., technology. And I know Alan will speak to some of this in his remarks. I would suggest also political indifference is a challenge to the development of proper or effective governance structures. And I would add to this, in the end, corruption, both within states, but across state structures. Now, these challenges are not restricted to organized crime on the seas, of course. They affect the development of effective responses to organized crime within the territorial confines of states themselves. Now, if I can use an example related to drugs, just to perhaps highlight these challenges. When we talk about drugs, we have 3 international drug conventions, which form a clear foundation for the development of national and regional governance strategies to respond to drug markets. The substances are clearly defined. There is strong global consensus on their prohibition. There is a global 10-year plan and strategy to which the parties to the 3 conventions have committed themselves. There is clear instruction to the development of national legal instruments and governance structures to criminalize these substances and their trade universally. There are innumerable regional agreements also to this end. There's been massive financial investment in technical, infrastructural, and personnel resources around developing a response to disrupt TOC. $100 billion a year is invested in supporting these interdiction responses. Joint task forces have been developed, military assets have been tasked, and millions of arrests and tons of seizures have been made. To use a specific maritime example, I would pull up a combined task force 150 operating in the Indian Ocean, which has been quite successful in disrupting flows from the Makran coast in Pakistan down the eastern and southern coast of Africa in relation to heroin. And yet, over this period, global drug markets have expanded from $153 billion a year to an estimated $540 billion a year. 73 million more people have become involved in drug markets at the end of this plan than were involved at its beginning. Despite the disruption and displacement that resulted from these efforts across both land and marine-based environments, the resilience of illicit markets, their structures and contributors continued to be evident. A more recent example, again using illicit drug markets and flows, is grounded in the situation we find ourselves around COVID-19. Now, in the eye of the current pandemic, we saw quarantines, lockdowns, border closures, and all of these stifled illicit economies around the world. Yet while large parts of the world slowed or even shut down, the criminal economy encountered some short-term disruption, but largely adapted to these changes and continued to move on. We're seeing evidence, of course, that the maritime criminal environment in particular was largely unaffected by these limitations imposed by states to curtail the pandemic. The illicit market has continued to prevail again. The adaptability to disruption and displacement of criminal activities and flows across these spaces, and in particular in maritime space, is a testament to the challenge before us. And I think the paper does an excellent job of outlining that. Now, I realize that in using these examples, we're not here to dissect the responses around the current global war on drugs, but I'll leave you with this. If such a significant failure can be realized in a situation where there was near unanimous recognition of the problem at hand, drugs, everybody was on board, alongside a unified commitment to a strategic global response, including individual state commitments on what they would do territorially. Everybody knew what they were going to do and how they were doing it. With billions of dollars and massive amounts of military hardware invested in this plan, there were partnerships and synergies and task forces and funds. Then what should we expect in terms of a reasonable response to the challenges of governance and disruption presented by blue crime, especially given the governance and jurisdictional concerns of these maritime places that Tim has raised, especially given their relative remoteness. Geographically, yes, but more I'm thinking in terms of their relation to political centers and their priorities, and the invisibility of many of these activities relative to security priorities. Yes, I think we've done a really good job of framing the problem of TOC at sea. The current state of the response to TOC at sea is one of fragmentation, lack of integration, and piecemeal assistance. Now, I guess the challenge before us in this discussion is, how does it get any better? How do we achieve these synergistic governance responses to disrupt these criminal flows and activities at sea if we can't, or if we have been unsuccessful in doing them in a more defined political and state-based space on land? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Maria, over to you. Maria, can you hear me? Unfortunately, we have a little sound problem here. I think, is your microphone muted? That's but obviously very misfortunate that we cannot hear you. I think I suggest perhaps Scott, can you sort this out for the moment, and then if it's okay for you, Maria, then we would just move to Cathy and then have you later on. Yes. Okay. Fantastic. Then I give the floor to Cathy, and I really hope that we can sort out the sounds problem. Sorry for that. Cathy, over to you.
Thanks, Christian. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay, so hi everyone. Cathy Haenlein, Director of Rusi's Organised Crime and Policing Research Group. So for those who don't know, Rusi is an independent think tank focusing on defence and security issues. In our Organised Crime and Policing Research Group, we cover a range of organised crime types, including a major research strand on environmental crime. Within this, we cover illegal fishing and wildlife trafficking, with a specific focus really on the convergence of these crimes with other illegal activity. We also run Crimson, which is the monitoring, support and evaluation mechanism for the EU's Critical Maritime Routes programme. So in the brief time I have, I'll run over some of the key points from our own research at Rusi before offering a few comments on the questions we're discussing today. I'll touch on the question of which crimes remain less visible, which was one of the questions put to us, and also a few comments on terminology, and particularly the question of whether we should speak of blue crime or transnational organised crime at sea. So on our own research, first of all, there are a few points that have come out of our work that are directly relevant to the discussion today. With support from the Pew Charitable Trusts, we've run 2 separate research projects on illegal fishing, resulting in Rusi papers published in 2017 and another one last year. So the first project focused on large-scale illegal fishing as transnational organised crime and the need for responses to address these organised criminal dimensions, rather than treating illegal fishing as a minor regulatory issue. The project also explored illegal fishing as convergence crime, highlighting the many different criminal activities with which it intersects. Illegal fishing vessels have previously been described as hubs for a perfect storm of illegal activity, and we really wanted to unpack these linkages a bit further. So in the first project, we did this through an overview of existing published evidence on a global scale. And in the second, we took this further to conduct primary research, really exploring how crime convergence varies between different countries and regions. We looked at 6 countries in Southeast Asia and the Western Indian Ocean. And we also looked at responses in these countries, how different agencies have attempted to address maritime crime convergence. How successful have they been, looking, for example, at the role of multi-agency task forces. So at Rusi, we've really come at the issue very much from the perspective of crime convergence. In the context of illegal fishing, we've looked at overlaps with upon forced labour, corruption, frauds, money laundering, all issues that the paper we're discussing today touches upon. So the point really coming out of our research is that you can't look at any element of this in isolation. This is truly a multi-dimensional threat. So from this perspective, it's great to see the steps forward that have been offered by the paper we're discussing. It's really good to see the focus on synergies and connections between different forms of transnational organised crime at sea. Conceptualising these as blue crime has the very welcome effect of stressing the maritime component to so many different interlocking issues. And from our own research, it's clear that this is a very neglected area. And that's resulted in overly fragmented responses and a very siloed focus on particular crime types in isolation. So I think this, to an extent, mirrors what's been happening with efforts to address serious and organised crime on land. Just as an example, in the UK, there's been a move away from a focus on individual crime types to a broader response, recognising the role of cross-cutting enabling crimes and the role of individuals and infrastructure, common infrastructure in multiple different crimes. The National Crime Agency, for example, in the last few years has moved away from identifying individual priority crimes such as firearms or drugs and instead has started to focus on high impact criminals operating across different crime types, and the need to tackle those cross-cutting enablers. So clearly there's a need for the same sort of shift in relation to organised criminal activity at sea. And I think the paper does a great job at moving things in this direction. It's really helpful how it stresses the dynamism of maritime crime and the dependence on common enablers such as vessels and ability to use violence. I just want to note here that we've come across a particularly poorly developed evidence base around enabling economic crimes. There has been a growing focus on corruption, but very little work has been done on money laundering. As the paper notes, and as Tim mentioned, transnational organised crime at sea is distinguishable from other maritime threats by the fact that it's profit seeking. But in the case of IUU fishing, for example, we found very little focus on these profits. How are the profits moved? How are they used? How are these criminal activities financed? One thing that we've looked at in detail is the extent to which financial crime authorities, such as financial intelligence units, are involved in responses. We found that in the case of environmental crimes, such as illegal fishing, they're very rarely involved. These crimes are very rarely included in countries' national risk assessments, which are conducted as an obligation under the FATF recommendations and are meant to shape governments' responses to money laundering risks. This is a really big gap, and one I would highlight in response to your question as to which blue crimes remain invisible. So in many ways, I think the paper highlights really critical issues around intersections in maritime crime and presents new thinking about how to convey these linkages. But I also just want to raise an issue or a question, a challenge around the terminology itself. So thinking about the terms blue crime, transnational organised crime at sea, sea-based crimes, the kind of terms we're using, the emphasis in all of them is on the sea. So distinguishing the sea from the land, which of course is the point. But the implication of sea-based, blue crime, crime at sea. But in some cases, I would question whether this is always necessarily the case. So the paper highlights very nicely the fact that different crimes have different relationships with the sea, on the sea, across the sea, in the sea. Tim's already taken us through this. The across the sea category, for example, covers crimes where the sea is used mainly as a conduit rather than the main site for the criminal enterprise itself, as the paper says. But the question I'd ask is, if the sea is not the main site, then where do you draw the line? So table 1 in the paper lists all the crime types with a maritime element. And this is obviously very many. Almost all transnational crime has a maritime element, given that 90% of global trade occurs by sea, and smuggling and trafficking often integrate with these legitimate trade lines. So by these criteria, does everything not then become blue crime? And blue crime as opposed to what? So I think the issue I'm raising here is that the term blue crime may risk actually separating out these crimes' land-based components, which are of course so closely linked to the sea-based elements. Just as one example, looking at the case of cigarette smuggling. So where cigarettes are produced in one country and smuggled to consumers in another country, there are a range of different methods involved. A lot of the smuggling takes place in bulk by container, which is of course the sea-based element. But much of it also takes place on land by ant smuggling over land borders, by post, by fast parcel. And the question to me is whether calling this a blue crime risks downplaying these land methods or implying that the maritime smuggling component is more important, which may or may not be the case. So just raising questions really about where we draw the line and what's included and excluded. And related to that, whether perpetrators of these crimes would necessarily think of themselves as blue actors, blue criminals, as another way of thinking of it. So of course there are many crimes that do happen for the most part at sea. IUU fishing, piracy, obviously very heavy maritime components, but they do still obviously have land components. And again, just a question about whether the term blue crime or transnational organised crime at sea, whichever you use, could risk downplaying these land-based dimensions. Of course, the authors and all the panelists are top experts, know very well about the land-based elements. Tim's already touched on this. But I wonder whether if the concept is taken up by non-experts who might be involved in establishing or signing off on new programs, whether the blue crime, as sort of neatly and nicely containing as it is, might risk sort of oversimplifying, focusing on the sea rather than the land aspects, such as the need to address land-based root causes, because ultimately these are all essential to prevention, long-term solutions, prosecution. So just to summarize, clearly the term blue crime has a lot of positives, very useful in highlighting the intersections between different types of maritime crime at sea, which is very much needed. I suppose I'm just wanting to open a question as to whether and how the terminology might also incorporate this complexity of the links between land and sea. So I'll stop there. Thanks for the opportunity to take part and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much for these comments and also critical remarks in terms of pointing us to the boundaries and the limits in terms of the land-sea connection. Apologies again for the technical problems, and I hope we now can hear you as well, Maria.
You hear me now.
Ah, fantastic. I give you the floor, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry for all this. I would like to thank SafeSeas and you and everybody for giving me the opportunity to comment. I would like also to say that the paper presented by Tim is very good and comprehensive, and I welcome these contributions because they raise awareness about this very, very important issue. So to follow up from what other speakers said, I would like to summarize the situation I see now as follows. I can see a gap between the momentum we have around, the increasing awareness of the crime, the interest of citizens and authorities about it, and the lack of effectiveness. There is a lack of effectiveness, even if we want to fight against it, we cannot really handle it in a responsible and effective way. So why this is happening? There are a lot of reasons, and some of the speakers already underlined some of them. I would like to add my experience, especially referring to the environmental crimes, the crimes against biodiversity, nature, but also the people who are responsible in a legitimate way. And of course, IUU is the most prominent case, but also pollution and other types are there. I would like also to underline that it is a connection between different types of crime, of transnational organized crime. For example, slavery is coming with IUU very, very often. Also, sometimes people use as an alibi the situation, the difficult social and economic situation. For example, the fisheries management was an alibi in Somalia. I remember when I handled on behalf of the European Commission this issue some years ago, the piracy in Somalia. The pirates, usually they gave us as an alibi the difficult situation of the fisheries management in their country and their need to have food for their children, just imagine. So everything is interconnected. I would prefer, that's why I would prefer a lot the term transnational organized crime. Cathy just mentioned that there is a very, very strong connection between what's happening on land and in water. So, for example, pollution is coming from the land, and I'm not sure, for example, plastic pollution or oil spills or whatever, it will be so easy to limit down to the sea. So how we can close the gap, how I don't have a lot of time for all the factors, but I would like to underline mainly two principles, 2 points, 2 pillars for action. One is international cooperation. If we are talking about international crime, transnational crime, we need international cooperation. And we have to admit that we are not there yet. This is one pillar I would like to underline. The second pillar is the need for transparency, full transparency at all public authorities levels, from United Nations to national level, and then to regional and local level. Transparency is a key word for everything. Let me give you just two examples. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but I would like to give you two concrete examples from my own experience. Then, first about IUU and international cooperation. As a Marine Commissioner for the European Union, I introduced this system against IUU fisheries, which is still in place. And it's a system with teeth. And the teeth became really actual and effective when I combined these teeth with some trade measures. So the people and the national authorities really care about money and income. This is, I'm not saying something, it's obvious, but you have to find ways to connect the punishment of these crimes with some really painful measures. So to give you an example, there was a country in the Asia that, I mean, it was a hostess for IUU fishing. In 2 days, they changed the whole situation. When it happened, when the European Union decided to block all the imports, fisheries products imports from that country. So this is the kind of measures we need. We need to connect international cooperation with trade measures and really measures that can be effective in forcing people. Sometimes we have to use force to force people to follow the rules. And of course, when Interpol was involved, that made a lot of sense. So we need really some effective measures and mechanisms to follow that. A second example about transparency. You can have a lot of measures, but if they are not compatible worldwide, you cannot really have results. So for example, we had the full transparency systems in European Union about the certification of the fish that was entering European Union. United States, they had a good system, very transparent about their imports, but the two systems were not compatible between them. That's why we had all this problem to join forces and join all the efforts against illegal fishing. We have taken some steps towards it. It's not there yet, but this can give you an idea how we are moving on. In certain places around the world, in certain sea basins, this is very difficult. West Indian Ocean is difficult, but not in that way. But let me refer to the Mediterranean, for example, right now. We have so many conflicts around the Mediterranean, and some of them are connected with national safety situations. I'm in Greece right now, and I would like just to refer to the situation between Greece and Turkey. It's not easy. Just to refer to the situation between Israel and the Palestinians and Lebanon and I don't know who else, Libya or wherever. So if there are conflicts, national conflicts, it's very difficult to go for this. So we have to think double to find the proper measures to face these problems. One last point, and I'll stop. I think we have to be more practical when we are discussing a bit about legal measures and about legal basis of crimes, because it takes so much time, so much pain, so much money to pay lawyers that at the end of the day, a lot of individuals, regional authorities, and even countries stop. They often stop from doing anything. So we have a long way to go, but I would like to say that I think we have gone far away already. We have done a lot. So what is ahead of us is the extra mile to finish the job. I would welcome any suggestions on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much also for injecting a little bit of hope, actually stressing that there are instruments that work and that we have come a long way already. I now hand over to Ellen, please.
Thank you very much, Christian, and congratulations to the authors on the paper. There's a few points I want to make. The first one is on a sort of UN high-level point, and that is we should keep in mind that the high seas, although they make up some 50% of the surface of the world, are of course not represented at the United Nations. Now, this may seem an obvious point, but when you're talking about regulating activities which take place beyond the jurisdiction of any single state, it is without doubt a disability that there is no advocate in the United Nations for the oceans per se. And this means very much that advocacy within the United Nations system for the oceans comes either from flag states or coastal states or states that use the resources of the oceans. And of course, the relaxed international approach to the high seas comes very much from a recognition that they must be accessible not only to coastal states and naval states, but also that all countries must have a right of freedom of navigation, including landlocked countries that obviously rely on the oceans to move their own goods around. So whilst member states find the complex jurisdictional arrangements a challenge in dealing with blue crime, maritime criminals see it very much as an opportunity. And they take the trouble, we know from experience, to identify jurisdictions which are weak at enforcement and prosecution, and then move into those jurisdictions, whether it's counterfeit printer cartridges being manufactured at sea off the coast of East Africa, or whether it's crimes that will fall into Christian and Tim's second group of criminal flows. So I think that is an important point to bear in mind. The second one is that it's most maritime criminals that the global maritime crime comes across, and we come across a fair number, are not sort of doctrinally linked to one particular crime. And by way of illustrating this, I asked, we have about 170 people full-time on this team now in I think 38 countries, but I went round those who are working with coast guards and asked them for examples of maritime criminals that were involved in more than one crime. And we came up with examples from the Gulf of Aden of groups that are involved in smuggling migrants north from Somalia into Yemen, and counterfeit medicines and firearms south, pirate groups in the Horn of Africa that are also involved in resupplying armed groups in Mozambique, heroin groups that are also involved in illegal fishing in the Eastern Indian Ocean, and in the Sulu and Celebes Sea down in Southeast Asia, Abu Sayyaf involved in kidnap for ransom and also in the fuel theft business. So there are, it's very important we look at these groups as criminals with boats rather than criminals that are dedicated to a particular crime. And I would commend the work of Stable Seas at this point, who do excellent research on the links between these different groups, and it's an excellent resource for those with an interest in the area. The third point I'd like to make is that legal finish on maritime crime is often particularly weak and also very variable. So while we've seen a pretty good rate of drug trafficking prosecution in the Caribbean, for example, it's much weaker in parts of the Indian Ocean or almost non-existent. Whilst we see reasonably active prosecution of migrant smuggling groups around Europe, we see very much less in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where I'm speaking from now. To some extent, this is a lack of laws and a lack of training, but it's also, I think, a concern by prosecutors and perhaps judges that maritime cases are, for some reason, more complicated or evidentially difficult, and that doesn't actually need to be the case with some support. And we're also very weak at prosecuting those who fund these maritime crimes. So I think I would have to take the now historic example of Somali piracy, where the international community was successful in detaining and trying 1,350 young Somali men who were found out at sea in boats. But the numbers of those involved in organising Somali piracy that have been effectively prosecuted are still on the fingers of one hand. And so long as that continues to be the case, we're not going to make a lot of progress. And then my final point, before I wrap up, I know we're a little bit behind time, is on the issue of sort of the context of wider governance, which is a point that Jason made. Maritime crime needs to be considered in the wider governance framework, and this includes issues like the regulation of floating armories, which we had thought were a phenomenon only of the Gulf of Aden, but we're now seeing much further south and on the other coast of Africa. The regulation of privately contracted armed security personnel, the breaching of UN sanctions as they apply to the maritime, and even the issue of digital border control. This is the matter of undersea cables and the threat posed to them by organised crime groups and terrorist groups and so on. So there is a lot of innovation needed as well. The seas are not just used perhaps for the three criminal purposes that the authors identify, but also under the sea, natural resources, and their use as a communications medium. So I think those would be my comments, Christian.
Thank you so much for flagging these additional issues, and in particular also bringing in the importance of prosecuting crimes, actually. We are now moving to the question and answers, so to say, and I had a lot of questions already coming in, and I hope we can address as many of those as possible in the time that we still have available. The first question actually brings us straightforwardly into the global governance dimension, and the question that I got is, it was largely in response to Jason. Do we need perhaps a new convention on blue crime, or an additional legal instrument, or perhaps also an international body which would take care of that field of crime? Or, to connect it to a second question, do we primarily will need regional instruments and regional, perhaps also informal coordination? So regions or a new international instrument. Who wants to pick up that question? Maria, perhaps you want to address this?
What I can say very, very briefly is that the regional action is always preferable if the problem can be solved on a regional basis. But some problems cannot be solved on a regional basis, and I think it was clear from all the previous speakers. So what I would suggest is to try regional measures, but at the same time we have to have in mind that we need an international legal framework that is not existing yet. So I would like to follow up and underline what Alan just said, that half of the planet, the high seas, they have no legal framework binding for the moment. And I'm referring to legal binding frameworks, not just to treaties that sometimes have noted.
Jason, you want to come in on that question as well?
Yeah, sure. Do we need a new convention? I think that I don't have an answer to that right now. Initially, I would say no. Certainly, we have a convention already that exists, which is the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. But I think the challenge that we're looking at here in terms of interdicting and governing the space was highlighted really well by Alan, because we're talking, in the most part, of space that exists outside of a territory, outside of a single controlling point. Are we able then, through an international convention or a dedicated agency, a new agency, for example, to better govern that space? I'm not sure. I would suggest that agreements that we have around outer space certainly demonstrate that there have been approaches taken to places where no one state has complete control, and these have been reasonably successful. But I think the politics of transnational organized crime in particular, and the origin points and drivers of these criminal flows and criminal activities, a lot of this rests outside of these, I'll call them empty spaces, spaces without governance, rests outside of them and rests inside places where there is governance structures and there is control, but it's not being undertaken effectively. And I think that's the greater challenge here is the ineffectiveness of our ability to address both the root causes and the origin and destination of a lot of this trade.
Thank you. Tim, you also wanted to come in.
Yes, I did. First of all, I should apologise. My internet went out, so I missed the end of Cathy's presentation. I missed the beginning of your presentation, Maria, so apologies for that. On the question, I mean, I think there are a couple of points I would make. I think one that I would support Jason's point, and again, it's something that comes out of the paper, that many of these are crimes that take place on sea. They're planned, on land. They're planned on land. They're organised on land. The profits are spent on land. The money is laundered on land, and so on. So I do think that even though there is of course the problem of the high seas that Alan mentions, there are ways in which these can be addressed, or at least partially addressed, by tackling them on land as well. I think on the specific question of the convention, one of the issues with that is it comes back to Jason's point actually about sea blindness and the lack of political priority that is attached to these kinds of issues. And I think the problem with that is not that necessarily a convention might not be a good thing, but it sets a very, very high bar to actually make it happen. And I do think there are some examples of more informal or regional organizations, like, for example, the contact group on piracy off the coast of Somalia, which actually looked for easier, or at least less formal, less legally binding responses to, in this case, the problem of piracy, and in the case of the contact group, with some success as well in terms of establishing a legal system for the prosecution of pirates and so on. So I think that there are potentially other ways we can think about this as well as through formal conventions.
Thank you, Tim. The next set of questions that I got concern environmental crimes. And here the question was in particular, do we have the right legal measures in place, the legally binding measures actually to address environmental crimes, or are the existing instruments too soft and do not go far enough in actually criminalizing some of the activities at sea? And related to that, there was a particular question then also related to Mauritius and the oil spill there. And of course, oil spills, that is usually considered a marine safety issue rather than a criminal or security issue. So are we too soft on environmental crime? And is that perhaps an area that needs particular kind of attention? And perhaps Cathy, you would like to address that first. Cathy? Perhaps I then move it to someone else. Ellen, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thanks, Christian. I mean, environmental crime is certainly catching the eye, but I think it's important to make sure we really are talking about environmental crime, or whether we're talking about sort of environmental contraventions of regulations. And of course, ships can flounder and pollute the oceans for many reasons, only some of which are criminal. Others can be carelessness or or accident or whatever. And the same, I think, this is particularly important in the area of fishing, that we take care to distinguish between IUU fishing and crime in the fisheries industry, which is something rather different. And we have to keep in mind that the Law of the Sea Convention specifically precludes sentences of imprisonment for IUU fishing, for those who've ratified it. I think Article 73. And that means it effectively stops IUU fishing being a transnational organised crime, because some form of imprisonment is generally considered a definition of a transnational organised crime. So I think it's important to realise the connection between environmental infringements, whether it's maritime pollution regulations or fisheries regulations, and necessarily organised crime groups. That's not to say that organised crime groups can't be involved in the fishing trade, which of course they are, and in waste dumping. And a good example of that, I think, would be the shipping of hazardous and medical waste from countries with very strict rules about its disposal to countries, including Sri Lanka, where I'm speaking to you from, which recently found itself in possession of a lot of containers of medical waste from Europe, which it didn't want. And that came here by way of an organised crime group. So I'm not sure more regulation is the answer, but probably more vigilance and cooperation, as with other crimes, is the solution.
Thank you so much. Someone else want to comment on that? Please just unmute yourself. Maria.
Yes, I would like to add something, especially on this Mauritius case. Oil spills, we have a very good framework to handle this challenge, I would say, legal framework. But we are lacking of capacity and how can I say, enforcement in certain areas is very difficult, very, very difficult. Of course, we have some hope because of the innovation and technology. Now we have satellites, we have other instruments that can be used, and this helped us a lot, but the local capacity is still a problem. So I would say that we need both. We need better legal instruments referring to environmental crime, but also we need to pay more attention in some countries about their capacity to go for it. And Mauritius, it's such a case. So I would like, we need both. And especially the capacity comes to the funding of that. We can say that UN is responsible, or I don't know, the governments or whoever. It's very easy to put the blame on somebody. But when it comes to capacity building, to funding this, there is a lack of money. And now with coronavirus and all the crisis that is coming after that, there will be more and more need for funds. So perhaps we have to think about how we can motivate not only the philanthropy community around the world, but also governments and local authorities, how we can motivate them in order to solve this problem. This is what I would like to add.
Thank you very much. Capacity building is super important. And of course, in particular in the case of small island states, we are not only talking about money and equipment, we are also talking about human capacity, and the populations of these states are of course very small. Cathy, would you like to come in on the debate on environmental crime, please?
Yes, sorry, my computer froze, but I'm back. Yeah, just on the question about legal frameworks, you know, as other speakers have said, in the meantime, it's of course important, and there's the issue of certain environmental crimes not being recognised as serious crime because of the lack of a 4-year imprisonment penalty. But I think there's a risk, as Maria's hinted at, that if we spend too long on the legal frameworks at the expense of capacity and enforcement, you could have the perfect legal frameworks, but still lack the capacity to actually do anything with it. So I think there has to be a balance in terms of enforcement and the actual practical responses. We've spent quite a lot of time in our research looking at experience in 6 different countries that I mentioned. And we've really been trying to pull out the experience, obstacles that have arisen, and good practice where we've been able to overcome those obstacles. And one of the areas that we looked in detail at was the use of multi-agency approaches, task forces, in an effort to bring into the response to environmental crimes such as IUU fishing, all of those different agencies that need to be involved. And I think, in designing new approaches, we have to look in more detail at the record of those that already exist. And we've seen certain sort of themes recurring in Indonesia, for example, with Satgas 115, and in Tanzania, the importance of not replicating task forces where other ones already exist, and therefore diluting the impact. The importance of making sure that the leadership of those task forces sit in the right part of government. That means that they have authority over the component parts, and the need to make sure that those task forces have the available assets that they need to mount an effective response. And just another question that I've seen coming in was about corruption. Just one thing to note is that there is potential for the sort of multi-agency task force model to have a sort of anti-corruption benefit if it means that there's different agencies involved, greater scrutiny, and more transparency. That's a potential benefit as well.
Thank you for flagging the notion of task forces and multi-agency, and it directly relates to one of the questions from our participants here today, which flags the question of what kind of agencies should actually be involved in blue crime, and whether it is better actually to have a lead agency, either the Navy or the Coast Guard, that addresses it, or whether we are better off with a broader combination, in particular task forces. Jason, would you like to address that question?
Oh yeah, a really easy question. Who should be involved in enforcement? Well, I guess the biggest challenge when we talk about enforcement, and we don't just have to talk about blue crime, we could use really any sort of illicit criminal flow as an example. And that's that across the countries of the world, there is not a uniform understanding or agreement around simple things like what is the role, for example, of the police? What is the role of a Navy, of a Coast Guard, of a border force, of an internal security body? All of these are entities that participate in one way or another in supporting national efforts against transnational organized crime, whether this be within the territory of a state, along its coastal regions, or perhaps further afield. So the fact that we don't have a common understanding across states in terms of who should be the lead when we talk about a particular type of crime, it makes it a challenge for us when we're looking at this as a specific issue. We can come up with some generalizations, of course, and we can say that generally speaking, when we talk about crossing borders, we should have some sort of border force that is the lead. When we talk about a marine environment, maybe we're talking about a Navy or a marine force of some kind. But then what happens if the state doesn't have that particular body? What if they don't have a Coast Guard or a Navy or ships? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with those gaps in what is this ring of enforcement we're looking at? The earlier question about whether we need a dedicated body to this, I think comes out of some of these challenges. How do we deal with the fact that the economic ability and technical capacity of countries around the world, particularly when we look at coastal and marine states, is quite diverse. So what is possible in one part of the world, perhaps one very developed system, is not necessarily possible to be equated in another, where the challenge is perhaps perceived differently. A final point I have on this is a point I raised earlier, and some other panelists have addressed it as well, in particular Maria, and this is the issue of political indifference. And there is a real challenge when we're talking about these issues to get strong agreement across states that it is in fact an issue that requires attention. Yes, this has gone to the Security Council, and that highlights the level of interest within the wider UN system. But the Security Council is debating this from the perspective of the security of the marine environment. And they are thinking of things like terrorism and proliferation of nuclear weapons and arms and things like that. They're not necessarily thinking about IUU or some of the other smaller issues that would be a priority for some of the smaller states. So who picks what is the priority? Who defines what things should be done? And who fills in the gaps in those places that can't be done? Big, big challenge.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, as Alan has highlighted, the oceans do not have a seat at the UN or in the UN Security Council. Tim, do you want to come in on that question? Navy's, Coast Guards.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting one. I suppose my first, I don't think there's a single answer to it. I suppose my first response is that it's the function that matters rather than the institution, and that different institutions and different countries have different models for how they deliver maritime security, whether that's whether that's in the naval capacities or indeed in Coast Guard capacities and so on. So in the UK, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency is largely about saving lives at sea. We have a separate border force to deal with border issues, and I think that there are different country models for how to deliver those functions. There are some challenges with that in terms of fragmentation between agencies. Different agencies having different kinds of priorities when it comes to dealing with shared problems. But I think they can be navigated through governance, so through security sector governance and effective security sector governance. I think likewise there can be advantages to having a centralized lead actor as well. But again, I think that can skew responses sometimes towards the interests and priorities of whoever that lead actor is. So in many countries, the lead actor in the maritime arena is the Navy. And sometimes it can be quite difficult to get the Navy to focus on things that are not to do with competition with other states and more traditional sea power issues, for very understandable reasons. That's what the institution is there for. It's how people are trained. It's the role they're professionalized into. So I wouldn't be too restrictive about it, but I think I would look at it as an issue of security sector governance rather than one of, you know, which institution is there a kind of a best practice model that we can apply everywhere, because I just don't think there is.
Thank you. I have one question which relates to, I assume it's largely a response to Maria, in how far better information sharing, in particular across environmental agencies and security agencies, could be part of the solution, and whether we should pay more attention to what some people call maritime domain awareness. And of course, that's also directly related to the question, what can we actually do with new technologies and satellites? Maria, you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. I would like to follow up on what Tim just said. After all, this is a governance problem. This is a governance problem, and referring to territorial waters, national territorial waters, it's up to each country to decide who is the institution, how they are going to interact, how they are going to cooperate, how they are going to not to overlap capacity and whatever. So we cannot do a lot about that, I think. It's up to each country to do whatever they want, the government of each country. Having said that, I would like to say that, especially about environmental crimes, usually they are not on the spot of these authorities. So there is an awareness campaign needed inside some countries in order to persuade the governments to understand and do something about environmental crimes. It's a rather difficult situation here, because usually environmental crimes are not concerned as crimes per se. They are concerned as crimes only if they have an impact in people's lives, whatever. Generally, I would like to add that I'm a little bit reluctant to involve Navy. This is my experience, because in the case of territorial disputes, there is a danger there to upgrade these disputes instead of calming them down and try to find peaceful ways to solve them. So it's really $1 million question. This last discussion points to some $1 million questions, and answers are not easy.
Does anyone want to comment on the information sharing of maritime domain awareness? Ellen?
Yes, I mean, the Indian Ocean is sort of testing testament to good intentions when it comes to maritime domain awareness and information sharing. As we both know, Christian, there are many projects around the region, some of which have flourished and some of which have failed. But I think it's also important with maritime domain awareness to bear in mind this isn't always a technological solution. Certainly UNODC provides some sort of top-end technologies around machine learning. We provide satellite imagery. We've been providing some to Sri Lanka today for a pollution case near here, and work with UAVs and so on. But some of the most successful maritime domain awareness comes from discussions with seafarers and the fishing community and so on. We need to avoid a fixation on technological solutions, because often the patterns of illegal fishing in the Horn of Africa, for example, can soon be discovered by discussing with fishermen who's out there taking their fish and what the ship looks like and where it's come from and so on. So I think it all needs to be looked at. There seems to be too quick a rush, I think, sometimes to high technology solutions which struggle for bandwidth and sort of technological support, where sometimes there are simpler solutions which are better.
So we need both better technology and simple solution. Cathy wanted to come in on the debate on agencies, please.
Sorry, apologies. Yes, just going back to the question about which agencies should be involved and leading responses. Just wanted to go back quickly to the comments I was making earlier about blue crime and use of terminology and, you know, the messages that might give to different agencies. So of course you've got agencies that are particularly blue focused, you know, inherently to their mandates, coast guards, navies, fisheries agencies, but then you've got others which of course are much broader, you know, police, prosecution, anti-corruption, asset recovery, financial authorities. And I think it's important that there's not a risk that if we call all of this sort of blue crime issues, that they don't see this not as something that's outside their remit and therefore are reluctant to get involved. Again, just pointing to the need to make it very clear that the response needs to be both land and sea focused, so that we can bring those land-based agencies in and give them a stake in the response.
I fundamentally agree that it's important to think land and the sea together. I think part of what the concept of blue crime actually brings to the table is that too often we start our thinking from the land and not the sea, and tend to forget the sea. And I think one of the benefits of the concept then really is that perhaps it's time to do exactly the opposite. Start thinking from the sea, but of course also then we should not forget about the land. We're almost out of time, but I got a very, very big question. So I would like each of you to address that. And that concerns the question that usually when we're talking about maritime security and blue crime, the focus is on piracy in the Western Indian Ocean in the past and now the Gulf of Guinea, or on illegal fishing. In your opinion, should there be other regions or other issues that require considerably more international attention? So what are the gaps actually of the blue crime debate? What are the silence issues that you would like to see taken more serious? Who wants to start? Perhaps Tim, we go in the order of program.
I'll make one very quick point, which is my immediate thought on it, which is that actually I think we need to take the transnational part of transnational organised crime at sea seriously. I think often when we look at these kinds of challenges, we see them as problems of capacity building for states in the global south, or problems that happen elsewhere. I think there are, when we start to think about finance, criminal finance, when we start to think about money laundering, when we start to think about things like supply and demand for things like illegal fish, I think that implicates all of us. So I think my perspective on this was that it would be that countries such as the UK, European countries, and many others need to look at themselves and the ways in which they are implicated into many into many blue crimes, because of the transnational nature of these activities, and whether there are things that they can do both at home as well as abroad in order to help address and ameliorate some of these challenges, particularly around issues of supply and demand, criminal finance, and so on.
Jason.
Yeah, I think Tim raises some good points. I would say, in particular in response to piracy, really, we know that the things that get attention are the sexy things, right? The things that are written about in newspapers and that politicians grasp on for one reason or another, whether it's a security agenda, it's a military agenda, it's an economic agenda. There's always an agenda at play. So inevitably, there are always things that are hidden by a focus that is narrowed onto a particular issue. And this is especially true when we talk about maritime crime. I think what we need to do is focus on the transnational nature of these flows and these activities, as Tim has said. And we need to, in particular, focus on the challenges that currently exist towards the better governance of responses towards transnational organized crime. And this starts, I would suggest, with the UNTOC, which, as I said earlier, I made an unflattering review of the UNTOC earlier. I think it starts with a better definition of what is transnational organized crime and a better orientation of the synergies and the support structures that are necessary for all member states to come together and create a better national response from their own perspective.
Maria.
I would agree with Tim in general. What makes sense now is to see more transnational issues. I would like to add also that we have to focus on what is happening in high seas. The high seas is the next challenge, I think. Referring to the environmental crimes, I think that the extraction from the bottom of the sea is an area where no much attention is paid. And I think this comes to the new needs because of technology and the rare earths and all these rare materials that are needed there. And they are going to be needed more and more in the next decade. And there are some countries around the world, I don't want to name and shame, but perhaps you can think, you can understand what I'm saying. Usually we are discussing about half of the world, and what's happening at the other half we don't care a lot. So there are areas where, yes, there are invisible challenges that we have to face.
Cathy.
I would highlight the economic crime, enabling crime side of things. You know, corruption, money laundering, as I've already mentioned. There's substantial anti-financial crime architecture and measures that exist globally, but are not currently being extended or including crimes such as IUU fishing. So I think that's a big gap that needs to be addressed.
Helen.
Yes, partly just to be different, I would also keep in mind the terrible detrimental effects of these maritime crimes on coastal communities and human development, and the potential for the loss of fishing resources and the loss of you know, the introduction of drugs to coastal communities to bring around threats of violent extremism and terrorism and so on. This is a well understood pattern, but we do need to look at maritime crime not only in its own right, but also as a huge disabler of human development, particularly for coastal communities.
Thank you all for flagging these issues and indeed for participating in today's debate. I think we managed quite well to explore some of these interconnections and also the argument for why we need to get better to find these synergies and think these issues together. We are out of time now. I would like to thank all the panelists and speaker, but also the audience for being such an engaged audience. We got many, many more comments and questions that we could address here today. And quite obviously, it's a debate that continues. And I'd like to invite you to visit our website at SafeSeas.net. And I very much look forward to continue this discussion on particular issues, but then also on the big picture that we addressed here today in the future. So thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to future occasions. Thank you.